I'm with the East Coast Environmental Law Association, as I said, and our organization is really about trying to create better environmental laws, making them more effective, more transparent, creating more accountability, and working with a whole variety of organizations and people around Atlantic Canada to do that and across the country. We do that, and I have a slide on this, but I'll just kind of move right through. We do that through three primary areas. We have a legal inquiry service, so you can actually contact us, and we provide legal information and legal advice. We work with and mentor students, law students at Dalhousie and other places, and work with them on a variety of projects. And we do a fair bit of collaboration and project work. For example, we have a project on developing a right to a healthy environment in Atlantic Canada and making that a legal right, which is something that's being worked on across Canada as well. But my focus today is to talk to you a bit about environmental impact assessment. And when I created this presentation, so I'm one of these people who, I usually do start early. I'm pretty good about that. And I create the kind of concept, and I make a bunch of slides. And then pretty much about up to 5 minutes before I walk in the room, I'm still reworking it and wondering what I'm going to exactly talk about. So I gave a bunch of slides to Charlene, and she's done a great job getting them on there. But I think that I may go off topic a bit, and I'll do my best to stay on be on time. So I want to talk a bit about environmental impact assessment, where it came from, what the problems are, and maybe where we can go next to try and improve it. And that's really the focus of my talk today. This is a picture of the Cuyahoga River. And I think that environmental law, whether it's EIA or another type of environmental law, often is created because of big disasters and big thinkers, or a combination of the both. The Cuyahoga River was a river in Ohio that in 1969 periodically caught fire because it was so polluted. And it was the results of things like the Cuyahoga River that was in the media that led to the creation in the US of the National Environmental Policy Act, which was the first big federal environmental law in the United States, and the first time that environmental impact assessment was incorporated into the law. And then we have somebody like Christopher Stone, who wrote a fantastic treatise back in 1972 about how we have a responsibility as citizens of this planet to create a public trust doctrine, where the externalities that Michael was talking about, those things that are so important, the environment, species, trees, we need to represent them, and sometimes we need to do that in the legal system as well. And he created a lot of discussion around whether or not trees should have standing in court, and who's going to take on that responsibility. And then we have something like Love Canal. Everybody remembers Love Canal, this idea that you could bury contaminated waste and then put a community on top of it, and somehow that was going to be okay. And it certainly isn't okay, and nobody really bothered to notice or think about it too much as it seeped into the groundwater and into the soil and created all kinds of contamination, until in fact it started to come up in people's basements and made them sick. And then there was a great deal of issues to deal with and money to be spent on the cleanup. So I think environmental impact assessment was one of those tools in the legal toolbox and the decision-making framework that really got created, in my opinion, to protect the integrity of the ecosystems that we depend on, the life support system that this planet provides for us. I mean, a lot of people would say that EIA is about making better decisions and considering things before projects go forward and proposals proceeded with, and I think that is true. But in essence, the reason why we do it is to prevent things like the Cuyahoga River and Love Canal and various other problems and concerns and environmental disasters that we've had, whether they be short-term or long-term. So when environmental impact assessment was established as a legal framework, the idea was that we could assess all these different projects, and there's just pictures of a collage, if you will, of different projects that could be considered before they go ahead, early in the decision-making, before any structures were actually built, so that we would think about what the consequences and the implications might be. And in Canada, federally, our first actual Environmental Assessment Act was created in 1992. And it's had problems. When there's a lot of case law actually around the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act over the years between 1992 and 2012, a lot of development of that law. But we lost most of that in 2012 when the Budget Implementation Bill was passed, which completely repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act under the Harper government and replaced it with CIA 2012, so a new Harper version of what environmental impact assessment should be in Canada, and it fit with the lines of the Conservative government at the time, which was to basically eliminate red tape for industries to move forward on projects, to get rid of any kind of duplication, actual assessment, and to try and streamline projects so they can get through the system more quickly. So there's all sorts of things wrong with EIA. I mean, let's be honest, this is an evolving process. And in evolution, you have steps forward and then you have steps backward. And I don't think there's any question with CIA 2012, we stepped backwards. And now we're trying to evolve forward again. I just listed some of the issues. This is where I think my presentation got a little too academic, maybe. But some of the key things that we've had issues with, particularly since CIA 2012, is that fewer projects are actually assessed. I know we're talking about offshore today and oil gas predominantly, but aquaculture is a really good example in Nova Scotia, where we lost all federal environmental impact assessment of aquaculture operations off the coast of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's catastrophic to not have that assessment. Federal focus in environmental impact assessment is on biophysical impacts only, not socioeconomic, not cultural. There's no real sustainability assessment. I'll talk about that in a minute. Lots of issues around lack of public engagement, failure to really assess the cumulative impacts, looking at what the reasonable possibility of other types of projects to take place within a certain time frame that would have a greater impact. This is Mount Polley in British Columbia. This was a mine disaster where a open pit copper mine, where a tailings pond was breached and ended up putting contaminants and basically destroying a water course. The point here, this project did go through an environmental impact assessment, and the after the fact analysis of the project that it was poor engineering design and failure to monitor that led to this particular disaster. So even when we have EIA, we all know that we still often have problems, and certainly things that I think that we could be addressing more satisfactorily in the process. So when Justin Trudeau was running with the Liberal Party to become the Prime Minister of Canada, he recognized, and I think he heard from many of us, about our concerns around what had happened to environmental law during the Harper administration. And he agreed and campaigned on a platform that said that he would look at all of those environmental laws, the Fisheries Act, the Navigation Act, what was the Navigable Waters Protection Act, the National Energy Board Act, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And he sent a mandate letter to his Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada and said, we need to have a reassessment of environmental impact assessment in Canada, and we need to try to regain the public trust around how projects are assessed and the processes that surround that. And so that initiated a federal review, and I know probably many of you have had some touch point with that review. An expert panel was appointed. That panel traveled across Canada and listened to, listened to people and took submissions, and now they are in the process of submitting a report on what their recommendations for a reformed environmental assessment process in Canada might be, and we'll have another opportunity to input into that probably in the spring, and we'll ultimately see what the Trudeau government decides to put forward, which I'll be very interested to see how they manage some of these issues. So I just want to talk for a minute then in my last few minutes about this concept of next generation environmental impact assessment. The Canadian Environmental Network has a caucus called the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus, and it's made up of some fantastic people who have been environmental assessment practitioners, environmental lawyers, environmental organizations, organizations, academics who have been working together for many years and recently came back together to create a report to submit to this process on environmental impact assessment, and they titled it The Next Generation of Environmental Assessment. And some of the key things that they looked at, and I've got a whole list there, and it basically gives you an outline of their 60-page report. But if I were to summarize it in my 3 minutes, I would say it's about cooperation instead of substitution and delegation. So what we've had in the last number of years is a lot of delegation of authority to provincial review processes or the National Energy Board, or coming along to something like the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board. The idea behind Next Generation is that you have one key federal independent body that's responsible for EIA, and they cooperate with other jurisdictions and other regulatory bodies, but they lead it, and they have a plan for leadership on environmental impact assessment. Another area I would say is really dear to my heart, especially having been part of the Whites Point Quarry process, is the nature of public consultation and public engagement. There are so many people, and a lot of you are in this room today, and many of you I know, who come to these consultations and participate in them and bring so much to the table. We have all kinds of expertise, and we have a lot of information that can be brought, whether it's community knowledge or traditional knowledge. And that's often what I find in environmental impact assessment processes is that the proponent is there ready to rationalize their project. They're not there to learn about what the community and other experts may be bringing to the table, right? And we need to change that. We need to create a mutual learning environment, and that requires early triggering. So in other words, the project has to get out there really early on so that people can participate in that process and bring their information and their expertise to the table. And the last thing that I would say is a big area in the kind of next generation of EIA is in the concept of sustainability and net benefit. And this is the idea that so much of what we do is in silos, you know, whether it's biophysical or economic or cultural, and there's not enough integration of these things. And the development of sustainability assessments is the idea that you ask questions in an EIA such as, how will this project create a net benefit for this community today, or for this region today, and still ensure that future generations have the opportunity to benefit? How do we make those decisions? And I think that is a huge part of where we need to go with environmental impact assessment. Am I still okay for a second? Okay. Yeah, I just had a couple, things that have driven us to be very concerned about impacts, in particular in the offshore, the Exxon Valdez, the Deepwater Horizon in 2010. And I think the one that Gretchen's going to talk about today, or focus mostly on, which is Old Harry in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And I said, I think, on my last slide here, if not a moratorium, then what? I mean, I don't think there's any question, certainly not in my mind, that there needs to be a moratorium on oil and gas exploration in that area of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. However, if not, then we need to be thinking about these next generation EIA principles to apply to processes like this so that we can have better environmental impact assessment for these highly risky activities where so much of the cost is externalized to the environment and to future generations. My kids, your kids, their kids. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you.